I built this thing almost entirely out of household items and trash. Like 95, 98% of it is just crap that you probably have lying around. Not all of it. There's a few tiny bits I used that were not household items, but you don't have to use those. You can build this out of trash. Hey guys, welcome back to Black Magic Craft. I've been wanting to do another modern or post-apocalyptic build for a while now, so I decided to go with what is a really classic bit of wargaming terrain, and that's building something out of cans. It's almost a rite of passage as a terrain builder to make some scatter terrain out of aluminum cans, and I'm really surprised that I haven't done it yet. So I finally did, and I decided to build this fuel tank or oil tank, whatever you want to call it. It's a really accessible project. Like I said, it's made almost entirely out of household items. I used a few 3D printed bits just as little extra embellishments, but it absolutely does not need them, and you can absolutely rock out a project like this with random junk. This one didn't turn out amazing. It was a bit of a struggle, but this project was really more of an experimentation than anything else, and I learned a fair bit while building it that's going to help me out on future projects. Essentially, I just kept throwing things at it until I felt it was built, and kept throwing paint on it until I felt it was sufficiently painted. This sort of thing is great for a lot of games like Kill Team, Necromunda, Gaslands, whatever your zombie killing game of choice is. Essentially anything that takes place in a modern or futuristic world or alternative universe, anything that might have oil tanks, it's gonna work and it's pretty fun. All right, let's just build the damn thing. Let's talk about cans just for a second. People doing these builds often default to typical 355 milliliter pop or beer cans, and I think that's a bit of a mistake. They're just too recognizable. Instead, I chose this longer and more slender can. It will be slightly less noticeable in the finished piece as a recognizable object, and I think its length actually better suits a fuel container. So if you're planning on building some stuff like this, keep an eye out for interestingly sized and shaped containers. First thing that needs to be done to any can is to make one end solid. You gotta cover up that drinky hole. I figured I'd fill it in with a circle cut from chipboard, but I realized immediately it would be really difficult to cut the perfect circle with a knife. Months ago, a company had sent me a bunch of foam cutting tools to play with, including a circle cutter. I never really got around to using them. They didn't quite suit me from what I saw, but I figured I'd give this circle cutter a go here. It didn't work. It created a sort of spiral cut on the chipboard, and the blade wasn't sharp enough to make it through the dense paper. Turns out the resistance from the chipboard caused the blade to bend inward and kind of made it spiral in, so this option was a no-go. But since I had it out and set up to the right size, I decided to cut the circle out of foam core instead. This worked a fair bit better, but the cut still wasn't as clean as I would have liked through the actual foam layer. I'm just not in love with this tool. The foam core itself was far too thick for the recess in the can, so using a handheld hot wire cutter and the lip of the can as a guide, I cut the foam core to the perfect thickness. The edges were a bit rough and had some small gaps that I wanted to fill. Since this would end up looking like an old rusty metal thing, I figured I'd turn to the old super glue and baking soda method to fill in the gaps, as this would be really strong and also kind of look like welds. Now, speaking of strong, I'm sure some of you are wondering about the durability of the can itself. Aluminum cans are quite weak and very easy to crush, and that's certainly true here. I think if you're making some of these and really want them to be durable, it's worth testing out different ways to fill them to make them more solid, especially if you're gonna take these to a club or something. You could go with something like plaster, but that would be really heavy. Alternatively, you could probably fill them with expanding spray foam, although I haven't tested that myself, but I may do so in the future if I decide to build more of these. Originally, I had planned on this thing being freestanding with no base because I really dislike big bases on terrain. So I needed some sort of feet or holders for it. Since they would need to be a bizarre shape that perfectly conformed to the circumference of the can, I used paper to mock up the pieces. Once I had shapes that would work, I used them as templates to cut the shapes out of foam core. I want to say here that this foam core I'm using isn't the easy peel stuff from Dollar Tree, it's Studio brand from Dollarama, and the paper is very well secured. This stuff doesn't peel off. This is far better when you want the paper to remain in place. It also has black foam on the interior, which doesn't really affect anything with the paper in place, but it's worth noting. The edges of the foam core were both ugly and susceptible to easy damage. I solved both problems at once by using some plastic zip ties to create cladding for the edges. They are the perfect width and have a built-in ridge pattern that will work great on a project like this. A nice way to add some simple rivets to foam core is by using a small pin to make a bunch of little puncture holes. It's not as nice as if you take the time to get something to make raised rivets, but it's infinitely simpler to do. The nice thing about building old rusty metal terrain is that you can be really messy with the glue and it doesn't matter much. It'll just paint up like welds and heavy rust. Or at least that's my excuse. In order to make this piece more useful in game, I wanted to add a catwalk on top for miniatures to stand on. This needed to be thin and durable, so I used my trusty medium weight chipboard to create a little strip. For some texture, I thought about using granny grating, but it's just a bit heftier than I'd like, so instead I used drywall mesh tape. This stuff has the same pattern, but it's much thinner, making it look a lot better at 28mm scale. This tape is awful for its actual intended purpose of taping drywall, but it's great for this. It also has a built-in adhesive, which makes it easy to apply. All you need to do is press it onto the piece and cut off the excess. Now to dress it up a bit more and add even more rigidity to the edges, I used the same zip ties again from before to create a border. This was pretty awkward to attach, but I think it was worth the effort. Now to actually glue it in place. I didn't trust hot glue, which doesn't stick to metal that well, and super glue would just be too thin for this sort of connection. There's no way it would work. I needed something goopy and thick that had really high adhesion properties. When that's the case, dollar store epoxy is the obvious answer. It was now time to add some piping. I used the same bendy straws that I used in my previous Mandalorian diorama. These make great piping in a pinch. The problem is that you can't really interconnect them, so you're limited to one bend and whatever length the straw is. I needed a way to make joints. Now, I probably could have found some coupler pieces online to 3D print, but I chose the craftier and more instantaneous approach of using what was just lying around, which happened to be larger paper straws. It just worked out that the inside diameter of the paper straws was a great fit for the plastic bendy ones. I could cut the paper straws into short segments and add joints wherever I wanted. Not the most glamorous solution, but there's no denying that it worked. I really wanted some of these straws to continue down into the ground, and without a base, they would just be far too fragile. They'd end up bent and broken in no time. I had to resign myself to adding a base. Instead of making a base that looked like ground, I thought it would be better to make it look like part of the structure. This way it could still be dropped on any terrain or battle mat and look good. It also means that later I can stack it on top of other builds if I ever make any in the same size and style. I wanted to ensure that it would not bow or get bent in the future, so I put a layer of chipboard underneath and clad the edges with more of those same zip ties. While the mesh tape has built-in adhesive, I'm not sure how strong it is or whether or not it's water soluble. So before going further, I decided to give it a coat of Mod Podge just in case to make sure it was fully attached and protected from hydration during the upcoming painting process. One of my pipes was a little short and already locked in place with glue, so I cut a small strip of paper to create another coupler layer to hide the gap. But I didn't do a very good job, and I ended up making the strip too short and just creating another different gap. This sort of stuff tends to happen when you start rushing a build. I figured I'd break out the cotton swabs to fix this. If you buy off-brand ones, not Q-tips, but the cheap ones from like the dollar store, you can get ones that have plastic stems. They're basically a really easy source of small plastic rods that you can use in place of the styrene ones that you'd get at a hobby store. I could use one of these to both hide the gap and add another layer of detail. Only problem is that I wanted it to look like the pipe or bar or whatever it's supposed to be was returning back into the larger one and not just ending in an open cut. The nice thing is that you can bend these into shape using a heat gun or like a candle. It's a little tricky with them being so short because you gotta keep your hands close by in the heat, but it can be done. This leads me to the most difficult and frustrating part of the project, the ladder. It really needed a ladder. The smart thing to do would be to 3D print one or find one from a supplier, but I needed it now, and I know most of you would rather see me struggle building something bad looking than print something good looking. So I set to work trying to do it out of the cotton swab stems. This was a bit of a catastrophe and would have been so much easier if I at least had longer ones to work with. Instead, I had to awkwardly assemble it out of multiple little pieces. But I eventually got something that looked okay. After that exercise in frustration, I said screw it, let's do something easy. So I grabbed some of the leftover 3D printed bits from my Mandalorian diorama and added some small embellishments. Of course, this is totally optional. You could just leave these sort of things out, or you could scavenge for bits to use to add these little extra details. Consider taking apart old electronics or toys for little greeble pieces. They are full of great options. With all the messy glue texture on the pieces, I thought the can itself might end up looking too smooth. So I decided to try adding some heavy rust texture using super glue and baking soda. This worked okay, but later I would end up deciding it was too minimal and cover it up with something else. Well, finally, it was time to prime this thing and move on to paint. Damn it.
Welcome to Team Podcast. Can I get for you?
Just one medium double-double, please.
Thanks. Holiest of holies.
Listen, I gotta be real with you here. The paint process you are about to witness involves many unnecessary and wasted steps and a lot of pissing around. I was super indecisive about how I wanted to do this. I wanted to figure out a hella simple rush paint job that required little effort, so I could bang a whole bunch of these out in the future. What I ended up with was a day of painting and testing to get a result that I probably could have gotten with 10% of the steps. So I'm not gonna walk you through them all here, but I am gonna show them to you. Just sit back and watch the madness unfold, and keep in mind the most important lesson here. It's just paint. Don't give yourself decision paralysis when it comes to painting. Just paint the damn thing. If you don't like it, paint it some more. Still don't like it? Hit it again with more paint. Just keep throwing paint, texture pastes, washes, and inks at your piece until you like the way it looks. With the paint finally at a point that I thought was okay, I moved on to some fun finishing details. I wanted it to look like some of the pipes were leaking oil, so I mixed up some more 5-minute epoxy and black ink to create a fast-setting, oily sludge. This actually looked pretty good, but I was careful not to overdo it. I then remembered that I had previously printed out some industrial warning signs for my dumpster build, and a few of them would probably look good here. Now, I should have added these earlier in the process so that they could have been weathered along with everything else. Obviously, it makes no sense for them to be super clean in comparison to such a worn out piece of equipment, but I wanted to use them, so I did. I just went back in and heavily weathered them with inks to the point where they were almost invisible. They were covered in so much sludge, but I think that was the appropriate look for this piece. Now, I don't think this build looks spectacular. It was made from household junk, and you can kind of tell. The paint job is pretty hack, but you know what? It really doesn't matter. It's a classic build, an aluminum can-based terrain. They always look a little bit off, and that's part of their charm. It will work well enough in game, but most importantly, it let me mess around with materials and techniques for a day, and since I usually build in the fantasy style, I'm still not really that great at these kinds of projects, so completing one just makes me a little bit better, even if it's not amazing looking. But really, it does look kind of cool, I think. What do you think? Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this build and this video. If you did, hit that like button and let me know in the comments section below. If you want to pick up any tools or supplies to build your own, although realistically, most of the stuff you just got to raid your recycling bin and your bathroom drawer. But if you need any of the other kind of tools and supplies like knives and glue and all that, you can check out my essential equipment page on blackmagiccraft.ca. There I've listed the things that I use the most, explained why I use them, and linked to them so you can buy the right thing. And if you really enjoy these videos I make, if you get a lot of actual tangible value out of them, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. That support goes a long way to ensuring that I can dedicate the time and effort and resources into making these videos each and every week for you guys and the community, and I'd love to have you as the newest member of the Blackmagic Craft Fellowship. That's it for this week, guys. I'll see you again next week. Cheers.